Little coffee, because this is just a little version of Coffee with Guillem. It's an espresso with Guillem today. Because I wanted to preview the England-Switzerland game from a different perspective. I still don't fully understand why football, which is clearly a mixture of the tactical, the technical, the physical and the psychological, abandons, in terms of analysis of the media especially, abandons the head, the psychological side. And in the case of England, it's such an obvious trait how the mind plays tricks with the players, and they're unable to be the same kind of players that they succeed in Germany, in England, in Spain. And it has to do, yes, with the obsession for names, yes, with the fact that some of the players don't play in the position. All that is important, but I feel there is a lot to say about the psychological side. So I decided to analyze this game from the point of view of the head, and I had the best at it to do it with. So I needed somebody who's an expert on sports psychology. That's Dan Abrams, who's with us, who is a leading expert on it. He's got 4 books that open the mind if you are interested about sports psychology. He was a professional golfer and has worked and is working with golf, Formula One, Feyenoord in football, and consults many other clubs, including the Premier League. Dan, thank you very much for talking to us.
Guillem, wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the invite.
This is not an easy subject, I imagine, one though that you've, I'm sure, thought a lot about. So start with the fact that when a tournament starts, there is one nation out of all others that seems to be falling in the same obstacle or finding themselves with the same problem regularly. There are exceptions, but this is happening regularly. And I cannot think of any other nation. That's England. What do you put it down to that it happens every 2 years?
It's a great question. And I just think there are so many directions that we can point to. There feels, firstly, if I start quite grandiose and say there feels like a bit of a socio-cultural thing going on. Maybe historically it's the style in which we've tended to play, and that style lends itself towards being a little bit fearful, being scared, getting rid of the ball. Just get rid of it is what you hear, in English football. And I'm being, I suppose, a little bit cliched there, but the socio-historical context has been a sort of a fear to be on the ball rather than necessarily a joy of being on the ball. And it's only really in recent years in academies in England where, probably through the influence of Cruyffian styles of football and latterly Pep, where being more comfortable on the ball has come into fruition. So firstly, the first answer I'd give you is that sort of deeper sense of the tactical, technical element influencing mindset and the style in which we tend to play, which tends to lean towards, well, I'm a little bit fearful here. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to look stupid. I'm not 100% comfortable on the ball. So it kind of tends to drive this feeling of hesitancy and uncertainty and inhibition. That would be, the first direction I would take. I suppose the second one would be the classic element of those England players, the perception of pressure. England were, my understanding, the inventors of football. We haven't won since 1966. In fact, we haven't done greatly well in the World Cups in 1966. This is the Euros. We've never won it. We haven't perhaps been as successful as we'd like to be internationally. Domestically, we produce such a wonderful game in the Premier League. And so there feels like this pressure from the outside world. They're saying, well, how comes you should be so much better? You should be winning all the time, So I think the players certainly feel the pressure as a consequence of media influence, if I may say so. And I would say perhaps the players themselves maybe have historically been a little bit guilty of perhaps being a bit skeptical on the mental side of the game. And I think this landscape is changing, but perhaps not being as open to exploring the kind of tools and techniques that we can introduce to them as sports psychologists. And so that's something that hasn't permeated around the England team for long enough, perhaps. As I say, that landscape has slightly changed now. But I think when you add these three things into the mix, and I'm sure there's other explanations, we could probably spend 2 hours alone on the explanations. When you throw these into the mix, ultimately, for me, I'm looking at the players, and too often you're seeing hesitancy and inhibition and uncertainty, which impacts awareness and anticipation and decision making and coordination and creativity and fluency of the execution of game plans. So it's all thrown into the mix. It's a somewhat complex affair, I'd say, Guillem.
There is clearly reasons that are, if you like, more football-like, more football-based for England not to play well. They want to be expansive and offensive, but they don't really build from the back with fluidity. They don't have a holding midfielder. They invent players like Trent in that position when he's never played regularly there. Things that, the left-hand side of the attack, these are players that come inside, so it doesn't add width. There is all that. There's no doubt about it. The obsession about names ahead of roles and players that can fill a role. There's multiple reasons for it. But I want to stay with the psychology, not only because I got you here, it's because I feel that people like Fabio Capello and Sven-Goran Eriksson or Rafa Benitez, these are three particular elite coaches, foreign elite coaches, who have tried to analyze England, and they've all come out with the same conclusion. The weight of the shirt is too heavy, and even though Eriksson and Capello had the ability to change that, they were unable to, and they fell in some of the same traps. That pressure that you're talking about, that obsession for names. The only time in the last 3 decades, if you like, where England have been able to perform at least to the level was when expectations were very low, hence pressure being very low, and people were just really happy with whatever, which was, of course, getting to the semi-finals of the World Cup and the final of the European Championships. But getting to the next level and doing it consistently is what you require the mind to be focused somewhere. And I think our conversation started privately when I put a tweet out saying, "You're all to blame. You are all to blame. The media, the fans, the other players, the pundits, because of that excessive pressure that they put in, and because they're not letting players get away with mistakes." So that's another thing, isn't it? That you already touched on it, that players now are fearful of the repercussions of a mistake, and that can inhibit you.
I mean, to be quite frank, and it feels like a more controversial statement every single day. I've been a Gareth Southgate fan, largely because of what you're saying. Because when he entered the England team back in 2016 after the Iceland debacle, he started to put into place cultural interventions. Things started to change behind the scenes. The language started to change a little bit at that time. He's had the help of two very, very good sports psychologists over the years. And interestingly, I'm not too sure, but I don't think there's anybody with them now from that perspective. But the cultural landscape changed as in the language. The camps themselves, the England international camps during tournament play, became a much more enjoyable place to be. He made sure the players felt relaxed, not just by inviting any kind of wives and girlfriends, the infamous wags from the Ericsson era, but very much the sense of camaraderie, the sense of teamwork. There felt like there was a letting go of the pressure and the burden. And players looked like they played a little bit freer, a little bit more on the front foot rather than the back foot. Played a little bit more like they were trying to win rather than not trying to lose. And subsequently, there were some decent results. They went deeper into tournaments for a few tournaments. So some success was there, all from cultural interventions, changing language. And the penalty kicks have been a case in point. Changing the language behind the scenes from, well, penalties, it's just about luck, and we've always done badly, towards, no, this is actually about skill. There's luck involved, of course, but this is about skill. And we're going to work on every player having a routine. And we're going to practice these. And we're going to practice these under pressure. The language changed. The behaviours changed. And so subsequently, England became more capable of going deeper into tournaments. But evidence still remained that there was still a little bit of fear there. And you can actually look at the UEFA technical report from the 2020 Euros final against Italy. The first 20 minutes, obviously Luke Shaw scored after 3 minutes, very early. The first 20 minutes were, in essence, sublime. Front foot, playing with freedom, striving to win. And then all of a sudden, back foot, playing not to lose, with fear, inhibited, uncertain. Italy had 70% of the ball. We hardly put in a strong challenge. There was fear rather than freedom. And so that the evidence suggested this was still here. Now, irrespective of the pressure from the fans and irrespective from the outside noise, it is incumbent on any coaching staff, any team, any squad to be able to have the tools to be able to play with a greater sense of freedom, a greater sense of positivity, a greater sense of striving to win rather than not striving to lose. It requires bravery. It requires courage. It requires every player to focus on what they can control. They need their own individual mental frameworks. They need a team mental framework. And Guillem, I'm not suggesting this doesn't exist, but at the moment, the evidence we're seeing is it is a little bit back foot rather than front foot. It's a bit of fear rather than freedom. So I would really, really like to see, anytime I'm personally involved, and I know lots of sports psychologists would engage with this, is helping players have simple individual mental frameworks that unshackles them and enables them to play with a little bit more freedom. And that word control is really, really important here. It's helping create a narrative where they focus on the things that they can control, which can be as simple as playing a brave pass, as simple as keeping great body language, using positive self-talk, paying attention to the things that they can control, other things that they can't control, giving players permission to make mistakes. Again, I'm not suggesting that Gareth Southgate isn't doing these things, but these things have to come front and center in every single tournament. In fact, I would argue they have to come front and center a year prior to the tournament itself in order to set the tone, the language, the environment of the team.
You've got a fantastic podcast which touches on all kinds to do with sports psychology. Whatever happens with the tournament in England, would you want to explore this further and not leave it at every 2 summers to be discussed? Is it something that perhaps you will explore through your podcast?
Yeah, no, thank you. The podcast is called the Sport Psych Show, and this is something that we explore most weeks, because I think it takes on multiple topics. It's coaching science, it's skill acquisition, it's mental skills, it's directing players' focus of attention. All these topics are what we talk about, and these are accessible for anybody to be able to listen into and be able to act upon, because every single team has the challenge of performing under pressure, not just England football, and every single international team has to perform under pressure. So yeah, all of these topics I think are fascinating. And I think the final thing for me to say, Guillem, is I think we have to open up these conversations. I don't think anybody, I work with some of these players, and I have absolute respect. These players have more talent in their big toe than I have in my whole body when it comes to sporting ability. But there is a missing piece here for England football, and we all want it to go as well as possible. And I think Gareth Southgate has done a great job, but we want to take it to the next level. And it's just making sure that things are in place that enable them to do that.
You know perfectly well we could talk about this for another hour or more. But I think this is a great insight into what we're about to see, because I'm not sure this mind frame can be changed from one game to the other. Hope England goes through, though. And if that's the case, let's see if there is any kind of evolution, mental evolution, which is as we hear, a very important part that makes you successful. Dan, it's been a complete pleasure.